Hello, I'm Monsignor Jim Lisante. Today on Personally Speaking, I'll be joined by New York Times best-selling author Nelson DeMille and his son, screenwriter and director Alex DeMille. Nelson and Alex recently co-authored their first novel together. It's called The Deserter. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Monsignor Jim Lisante, and Nelson DeMille and Alex DeMille join me now. Nelson DeMille is a New York Times best-selling author of 20 novels, 6 of which were #1 New York Times bestsellers. His novels include The Cuban Affair, Plum Island, and The General's Daughter, which was made into a major motion picture starring John Travolta and Madeline Stowe. Nelson is a combat-decorated U.S. Army veteran, a member of Mensa, Poets and Writers, the Authors Guild, and a member and past president of the International Thriller Writers. Nelson's son, Alex DeMille, is a writer, a director, and a film editor. He grew up on Long Island and received a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a Master of Fine Arts in Film Directing from UCLA. Alex has won multiple awards and fellowships for his screenplays and films, including The Absence, which was named Best Film at Comic-Con in 2012. Nelson and Alex collaborated for the first time, co-authoring the suspenseful military novel The Deserter. This wonderful father-son team are here with us today to discuss their work together. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking, Nelson DeMille and Alex DeMille. Alex, let me start with a non-novel question that I've been dying to ask someone who would know, and who better than you. What kind of a dad was Nelson DeMille?
He was a great dad. I mean, growing up with him was, it kind of gave, I was lucky in that it gave me license to, obviously growing up around a creative person, but I think it also gave me license to kind of be creative and pursue it on my own. So I, grew up with stories and reading history and, plenty of practical jokes, and it was definitely a place where it fostered a lot of imagination and kind of playfulness and creativity. So that was nice. And we always took them on trips, and, I felt like it was it was a good childhood. Good dad.
Well, that's great to hear. And let me ask you, too, because Nelson's been a guest on our show before. He's talked about the values that have sustained him in his life. Do you remember, Alex, offhand, how Dad effectively communicated the things that he valued to you?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. You want to answer that?
No. Sorry.
Effectively communicated the values. It's hard to think of specific examples, but I do feel like, I'm a new parent myself right now. I have a 20-month-old daughter. But it was, always looking for kind of learning moments, even at this young age. Like when do you kind of pause to kind of put whatever is happening into a bigger context? And I do feel, I have a sense he did that a lot. Whether it came I grew up in a very privileged background, and he always made sure I knew that.
Yeah.
And then to know that, you understand that you're fortunate. Not everybody's fortunate, and be grateful for it. That was a very important, one of the most important, I think, values I grew up with.
Yeah. My first parish was St. Boniface in Elmont, and I've said to your dad before that the people in Elmont are salt of the earth people. And one of the things I've loved about your dad over the years is, while you're right, he's led a privileged life as an adult, but he never seems to have left completely the normalcy, the regularity of the good folks of Elmont. Did you feel that, Alex, that he was, at the end of the day, a pretty down-to-earth guy?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think he's somebody that, I know his father was a house builder, and I think he's maintained that kind of respect for people who create things, whether it's with their hands, actually producing things. Yeah. And a book is not the same thing, but you're still creating something. It's not you're not just kind of spinning the wheels, and But I think he's always had that value, that down to earth kind of quality about him, and also that value of work.
Yes.
Which is a good work ethic too.
We're here talking with Alex and Nelson DeMille. The new book, which I hope our listeners will get, is called The Deserter. Now, my obvious question, I remember years ago we had interviewed Mary Higgins Clark, and she had a hard time answering this. Hopefully you'll have a better time of it. How do two people write one book in terms of finding a similar voice?
Well, yeah, it's your question. And we had to make that decision right up front. There's different ways to collaborate. Sometimes writers will write alternate chapters, which you want to have two different voices, and also there's a lot of, I guess, rivalry, and sometimes it's not the most pleasant experience. I did it once before with somebody else, a childhood friend of mine from Elmont, Tom Block, who was a U.S. Air pilot. We wrote Mayday together, and it was made into a TV movie, very successful book, but didn't do much for the relationship. We barely spoke for about a year until we decided to bury the hatchet. I mean, literally, it was just a terrible experience for childhood friends, even though the book itself was successful. So I just decided up front that Alex is going to write the first draft because he's a screenwriter. So he knows how to write and he knows how to, structure a book. And I said, you write the first draft and I'll be the editor. After 40 years in the business, I know how to edit as well as I know how to write. And then it worked that way. Alex did the research, he did the structure, and really wrote the book. I came in and just gave it that second rewrite that it needed sometimes, and not in every place. And I gave back to him with some suggestions, and then came back to me and back to Alex for the fifth time. And so it was like 5 passes, and Alex got, final cut. And that's what we sent to the agent and the editor.
Okay. Alex?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was always the challenge was how to. I mean, my dad has such a distinct voice, which I think has always probably made it one of the reasons that it wasn't an obvious choice to collaborate with anybody else. So I'd like to think that by growing up with him, I've kind of internalized that to some degree, and also maybe having read his books once I was of an appropriate age, and having a kind of, I think, a certain instinct for why they work, even if I don't always know how to replicate it or do that. But I certainly have a sense of why this is a Nelson DeMille kind of thing, and maybe this isn't, which I think then has also informed my own taste, obviously. But yeah, so I set out not thinking I'm going to try to copy his voice, because I wasn't. That's a recipe for failure. But,
right.
Knowing the kinds of characters that he likes to populate his books with, and the kinds of stories, I kind of just took that as a jumping off point, and knowing that my name's on the book too. It's not, we're not trying to hide that fact that this is. So we wanted it to be in the same genre, same kind of voice, but doesn't have to be exactly the same. It should be a little different. Hopefully, I did bring something a little different to it. But,
I was going to ask you, Alex, originally this question, but actually it applies to both of you. With The Deserter, Alex, you come with this younger and creative vision. Your talent is unique to screenwriting in many ways, but your dad is this long-established author. At the same time, your dad wants to, take your gifts and apply them to this writing. What I'm getting at is, were either of you ever intimidated by the necessity of saying to one another, this thing you just wrote or this direction you're going, I think is wrong? Are you guys able, as father and son and as co-writers, to say, I'm not buying what you're selling right now?
I'll let Alex go.
Well, there was a few times when that happened. Because it was more him to me, partly because of his age experience. B, I was the one writing the first pass on everything. So there was a couple times where it was rare that I wrote something where you said, this is the right idea, but you didn't do it very well or something like that. It was more that I was sometimes kind of I got a little unfocused, especially in the middle of the book. And so in the middle of the screenplay, in the middle of a novel, that maybe you're equally difficult. That's kind of where you can easily get lost. And there was a couple times where I started going off on a little bit of a tangent. And as in the role of editor, he said, we don't need these 2 chapters. We can go from A to D, and it's going to work a lot better. There was a couple times we did that. And a little bit of the interplay between the 2 characters, male-female CID agents who were closer to my age. They're in their 30s. So there was a couple things, the way they interacted, that he had done something where I said, well, maybe, and it wasn't even about being PC or not. It was more about how would a man and woman of this age interact with each other. It was difficult. And at the same time, they come from a military background that's more, he has more experience than I do. So there's some ways in which he would have a better handle on that anyway than I would. So it was a kind of a balance, but I think we were mostly on the same page.
And Nelson, would you find it easy to tell your son when you thought he wasn't on target?
Hey, Alex was learning, and he wanted to learn, and I'd say it was a screenwriter, so I think he found a lot of it interesting, a different kind of writing, and he brought a different age perspective to the whole process. You'll see, as you did when you read it, references to some songs, references to some some technology that I only have a vague idea of. So, this thing reads young, as our agents say. The book reads young, meaning probably my books read old. I don't know if they mean by that, but so you have a young guy who understands that generation. Having said that, I think one of the things Alex did was my only major criticism, he kind of softened the main character. My guys, they're really kick butt kind of men, maybe from my generation, and Alex is a little bit nicer in his personal life and his writing life. So I said, you got to toughen this guy up. This guy, I wouldn't be afraid of this guy. And you got it right away because being creative. If you're creative and you can write a screenplay, you can write a novel with a little training, and then the obverse is true. I mean, I cannot write a screenplay by myself. I don't know the rules and regulations of telling a whole story in 90 to 100 pages and carrying the whole story through dialogue. So I learned something. I learned that dialogue can carry the plot too. With a novel, you have a lot of opportunity to just wander around the page if you want. But a screenplay has to be 90 to 100, maybe 120 pages tops, and it's got to tell the whole story through dialogue.
Right.
So that was interesting to see how he did that.
Alex, in another interview, your dad said that he knows that because he's a novelist and he tends to write long, that there were times he goes on and on when maybe it needs to be tightened up. Your gift seems to be the ability to tighten things up. Do you see this, in fact, the dessert of the novel, someday as a screenplay, someday as a movie?
I do. I definitely think it is. I didn't. While I was writing it, I wasn't thinking about that, just because I think you can't really. I think you can't write. I mean, some people do write books then to think, okay, if I write this and it's like a film, then somebody's going to buy it and make it into a movie. I mean, I wasn't thinking like that, but people have told me, it reads quote unquote cinematically, whatever that means. But I did enjoy I enjoyed setting the scene, which I think my dad does very well himself. But I enjoyed the kind of prose element of it that is an important part of a film, but can't really take up much room on the page of a screenplay, describing what places look like, what people look like, etc. So I enjoyed all that scene setting, which maybe is what people are referring to when they're saying it. They can kind of see all the settings and whatnot when they read the book. So I could certainly see it being a movie, yeah.
For our listeners, the book is called The Deserter. We're here with Nelson and Alex DeMille, father and son, co-authors of this. One of the things that I remember you said, Nelson, in another interview, people were asking why was the setting placed in Venezuela, and you said, I chose Venezuela because I find strong men and the cult of personality fascinating. And you're right, but I'm wondering why in 2019, 2020, there's an abundance of strong men and leaders around the world who are highly nationalistic, highly over-the-top, macho-type guys leading countries. Do you guys have any insight into what's going on in our larger culture around the world that people who are specifically strong men seem to be flourishing?
Well, that's a good question. There was actually a Cuban expression that I came across, which says, comes the hour, comes the man. And I believe that sometimes. We saw that certainly in the 1930s with Roosevelt and the bad guys, too.
Right.
We saw it at the right time. Sometimes the right man comes along for the right reason. Sometimes it's the wrong man for bad reasons, like in the 30s. It was really more Alex that convinced me Venezuela would be the good setting. This book is based loosely on the Bo Bergdahl desertion case. With Bo Bergdahl, remember,
yes,
deserted Afghanistan and captured by the Taliban. But we took it a step further that he breaks away from the Taliban, he escapes, and then he has to wind up in a country that's going to be if anything, worse than Afghanistan.
Right.
And it was actually Alex that came up with Venezuela. I give him credit. It was a good choice.
Alex, you want to add to that? Why Venezuela?
Well, I knew that wherever we picked, it was a place that I had to spend a lot of time. I either had to go there or I had to spend a lot of time researching it, or both. And we ended up not going just because of the security situation.
Right,
but
right.
I was, I mean, even from I think it was '99 when Hugo Chavez was first elected. I always thought he was kind of an interesting character. You know, he's such a larger-than-life kind of, like a lot of these guys. He's kind of buffoonish, but also a little frightening. And I thought that in the country itself, which had gone from being this very wealthy country, and obviously had a lot of problems before he came along, which is why a guy like him comes along. You know, I mean, I think a lot of these people who are kind of coming into prominence now, it's because of these problems that have been simmering, and eventually somebody comes along and gives a simple solution to very complex problems, and people are drawn to that. And I thought Venezuela specifically because you had this kind of, it wasn't just the cult of personality of Chavez himself, but it was the way they kind of drew back through history with Simon Bolivar. And it just seemed like a place that was kind of full of like interesting meaning, and also the fact that it's in America's backyard. And if we're talking about, one of the themes of the book is that these wars that are dragging on forever, you know, Afghanistan, and there's a larger war on terror. And in a way of it is the United States going to turn its eye back towards its own hemisphere, you know, back to kind of what the ways we used to meddle, is one thing I was thinking about. It's a world that I think probably used to be a lot more in American consciousness than it is now.
Right.
So I thought it'd be an interesting place to come back. It's something different than the Middle East again.
Interestingly enough, Pope Francis, no less a person than Pope Francis, regularly in his talks has been warning us about the dangers of nationalism and strongmen who use nationalism to capture their people. And maybe going back to what you were saying, Nelson, maybe the Holy Father's fear is that we return to the 30s in terms of some of the bad dictators that arose from that. I want to, you know, just not to move from Bergdahl for a second in Afghanistan, because for our listeners, Nelson DeMille also had the experience of serving in the military with honor and serving in Vietnam. And Nelson, I'm old enough as you are to remember that for all the peace talks, I think we all knew in the back of our minds that as soon as we get out of there, it's all over. The Vietnamese are going to fall under communist influence. I'm thinking the same thing now with all these talks with the Taliban. That, you know, yes, the Americans to death, but once we're out of there, Afghanistan is Taliban territory again. Am I wrong? Am I being cynical because of Vietnam? I mean, what's your hope?
No, I think you're totally right. And it's funny, about 3 weeks ago, I went to a Vietnam veterans dinner at the Union League Club. They had a dinner for Vietnam veterans, and there's fewer of us now. We're looking a little bit old, but the guest speaker, the surprise guest speaker, was Henry Kissinger. None of them, it was actually two. General Petraeus spoke, and then Henry Kissinger spoke, and he got up and he spoke about the Paris Peace Accords for about half an hour. Basically justifying what turned out to be a disaster.
Right.
And, and I found it amazing, half a century later, this is still on his mind. He could have just thanked us for our service and whatever, but this is obviously something that he's obsessing on. Yeah, I mean, we were Vietnam veterans, but, and most of us, I think, at this club were probably officers or, I think so. I think one of the people I'm remembering mostly was educated people. And we're not going to be convinced that the Paris peace talks were anything but what they were, a sham.
Yeah.
We knew it then. We know it now. And poor Dr. Kissinger is still going on about how it could have worked and should have worked. It never was going to work. You're absolutely right. As soon as the Taliban, Ben Franklin said, neither a fortress nor a virgin will hold out long after they begin to negotiate. And that's where we are now. We're negotiating with the wrong people. We didn't negotiate with the Nazis, thank God.
Yeah.
And the Taliban are no different than the Nazis. I'm sorry, they're no different than the Nazis.
No. People
shouldn't even be spoken to. But that's my personal opinion.
I think you're onto something there. And Alex, if you have a different point of view, we welcome it. But I tell us by all means.
No, I think the war. I mean, I think the war was lost when we invaded Iraq. When that was. I mean, I think maybe there was a chance, back when, because the beginning of the war seemed to be executed very well.
Yes.
Because there was a plan that they clearly had in their back pocket, and they knew what they were doing, and it got Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but it seemed like it got away from them. The focus was turned away, resources were taken away, maybe overconfidence. And I think there was a chance to prove something, to prove that this government can be legitimate in peace and prosperity with American involvement. But after almost 20 years of war and violence, they no longer can make that argument.
No, I think you're right.
I think it's lost, yeah.
Let's go back to The Deserter for a moment. Did you guys have a chance or an opportunity, or was there any insight that you could get from interviewing Bergdahl himself?
No, I never even thought about it, actually. He's kind of a pathetic character.
Yes.
Our deserter is, quite different. And this is Alex's idea. He made him a Delta Force captain.
Yeah.
So it's a little more, shocking when he deserts his post in Afghanistan. Bergdahl, I just inspired the story, but when I started doing a little research on Bergdahl, I found him not only pathetic but uninteresting, and there's nothing there that gave us any idea at all, other than the idea of why would an American soldier walk off his post. It was just that little spark that sparked the idea of the book. But I thought Bergdahl might be more interesting when he came out of captivity and he had something to say. But turns out he had nothing to say, so we just forgot about him and we moved on.
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I've listened to season 2 of Serial, the podcast. They do one story over many episodes in season 2. It's basically a maybe 10-hour podcast about Bo Bergdahl, and I didn't even. This was well before the book was even existed. I listened to it, and it was kind of captivating at first, and every hour that went by, it got a little less interesting. And the more you learn, you peeled away the onion of this guy, and at the middle there wasn't anything. It got less and less interesting. So I think the question, why would you do this, was very interesting. The answer, whatever the answer was, and there's still no clear understanding. Even after 10 hours of this podcast, there's no clear answer. He has his explanation, but it's just not that compelling. But the mystery is compelling, which is what we took.
Right, and for our listeners around the country, the deserter in The Deserter is far more interesting than Mr. Bergdahl. Let me ask you, you had to know that if you're being interviewed by a priest, you can ask this. I'm wondering for you, Alex, taking a step into another world. Your dad is a man of faith, and like all of us, there are ebbs and flows to that faith. Nobody comes out perfect in terms of their embrace of faith. But do you remember growing up how your dad was able to or not able to pass on to you spiritual values?
Well, one thing, I was raised Jewish, actually. My mother's Jewish,
okay.
So I was raised Jewish. But we did, we went to Mass on Christmas on the major holidays, and then traveling around. Most of the travel we did was around Europe, and I think through that and seeing all these historic churches and kind of learning about the history of Christianity in general in Western Europe, I kind of got a good cultural education of the cultural value, the artistic value, the spiritual value of religion, almost from an intellectual standpoint in a way. Because again, I wasn't raised Christian; I was raised Reformed Jewish. So,
right.
But yeah, so that respect, and also there's the awe-inspiring sites, the creations that have been made. St. Peter's and all these places that we would go around. So I definitely grew up with a respect for it and a kind of humility as to the scope of this thing and how it's kind of shaped the world and shaped people's lives.
Alex, let me ask you, with most of my friends in New York who are Jewish, they usually identify themselves more culturally, historically, tradition, but very few of them talk about being spiritually Jewish. Were you both or largely cultural?
It was largely cultural. I mean, I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvah.
Okay.
I didn't, and I went through a rebellious, when I was 12 or 13, and I cast it all off. And then, again, it's kind of the same, really, I've had pretty much the same feelings towards Judaism as I do to Christianity, which is kind of this, more of a respect for it as a kind of vessel of meaning that exists for a lot of people. I don't personally, I take it as a value system.
Right. Okay.
And also, and I take it that way. And I think in that capacity is very important. And it means more to other people, and I respect that. I think that's important too. But
yes.
Not quite the relationship I have.
No, I like that a lot. Nelson, most every weekend I celebrate a Catholic-Jewish wedding, and it's very commonplace now. It's not a big deal, and it works beautifully, and everybody leaves happy with the rabbi and the priest. But back when you did it, obviously getting into the marriage that produced wonderful Alex, it was not that widely accepted. Did you get any kind of blowback for marrying outside your faith back then?
No, not really. And this would have been, oh gosh, I don't even remember my anniversary over the year I got married, but it was probably 1973, let's say. We'll make a good guess. And it seems like the dark ages, but no, my parents were okay with it. Her parents were okay with it. And I live in Garden City, which is, a very insular community, to say the least.
Right.
But there was no problem here. There was some talk that, could I get into the country club with a Jewish wife? And, anybody has the ability to anonymously blackball you. All it takes is one, and you don't get into the country club. But there was not a single person who raised an objection to a mixed marriage. And there are a number of mixed marriages in the Garden City, more than we realized. So the temple here, I'd say, Alex, about 3/4 of the temple, at least in those days, were the children who were going to, Hebrew class and bar mitzvah class were products of mixed marriages then. So it was, I think, more common than we realized. And again, I think maybe knowing the origins of both religions, I think people are educated a little bit more. A lot less likely to be anti-Semitic because educated people remember that Christ was a Jew.
Right. I want to thank Nelson and Alex DeMille, first of all, for being so open with me in this interview. They're wonderful, but also for producing The Deserter, which I loved. Now, we talk about it as a novel today, but I have a funny feeling we're going to see this as a movie someday. I'm encouraging our listeners, don't wait for the movie to come out. Get the book, read the novel. It's great stuff, and I thank Nelson and Alex for being a father-son team who have produced something wonderful. Thank you guys so much for being on our show, and much success to you in your future writing career, too.
Thank you, Monsignor. Pleasure as always.
Thank you, my friends.
It's been great speaking with you.
Happy Hanukkah and happy Christmas. Thank you, my friends. As we end today's program, I want to thank you all for being with us. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can send them to me through our website. That is www.closeencountertv.com. Again, www.closeencountertv.com. Or if you want to listen to past Personally Speaking episodes, go to the same website. Just click on the radio button at the top of the page. Please be sure to visit that site and encourage others to do the same. And you can also listen to past Personally Speaking episodes by going to www.ollmp.org. Again, www.ollmp.org. And you'll not only get the show, but you'll get weekly homilies by Monsignor Jim Lisante. I'm privileged to serve as host and executive producer of Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Our engineer is Chris Wallich. And our audio facility is Dream Recording Studios on Long Island. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.